Heightened restrictions about what women can and cannot do with their bodies is just a fact of our world today. Half Lives is a collection of stories by Lynn Schmeidler that explores themes of girlhood, sexuality, motherhood, identity, and aging in a world bent on controlling the narrative. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. I spoke to Lynn Schmeidler about her story collection, Half Lives, which was selected as the winner of the 2023 Autumn House Rising Writer Prize in Fiction. One thing I'm really interested in is the structure and the organization of story collections. So tell me how this one came together.
It wasn't always called Half Lives, for one thing. It had different names at different times, sometimes other names of other stories. Sometime at one point it was called Possibility Hunger. And it kept changing because I kept writing different stories. I write stories because I want to figure something out that's bothering me, something that's strange to me, or something that feels off in the world that sort of strikes me. And so I would write a story to explore that after I had a number of them, and I realized that they spoke to each other in a certain way. I realized I had a collection, but I kept writing stories as the collection was forming, and so I had to keep booting stories out and putting the fresh ones in. And so it morphed over time. The names changed, the order changed depending upon what was in there. But I did keep coming back to Half Lives as a title because that felt like it had the strongest kind of reverberations.
So the idea of Half Lives on its own is so compelling to me as the title of the story, as the title of the collection. But I'm wondering then, with Half Lives, when you knew that that could be the title of the collection, did it influence how you were thinking about the stories the additional stories you were writing, or that you were still maybe writing or still revising?
Probably it did. So Half Lives is the name of the whole collection, but it's also the name of a particular story, as you know. And so the story that's called Half Lives is about a teacher who chaperones students on a trip to a nuclear power plant. So I loved the idea of Half Lives being both a radioactive reference and also a reference to something that's split or that's divided or that's not quite whole in terms of a life. And I think both of those aspects of Half Lives come into play in all of the stories, because I think all of the stories talk about women's lives being kind of divided as well as feeling infinite, even when the life is over, as in Corpse Pose, where the narrator is actually already dead when the story begins.
So I'm going to riff off of something that you said. So we're in a time when American women are far more restricted than they've ever been regarding what they can do with their bodies, what they cannot do with their bodies. And so when I hear Half Lives too, I think about how your stories seem a reflection of this fact and a rejection of it, I will say. So this idea of a woman's life being not whole, not half, but not a composite whole, like somehow affected, diminished, controlled, constrained by something else, and that's sort of the connotation of half as incomplete, or at least the intimation of that for women in our society. And I feel like your stories really are reflecting this, what women go through just in their daily lives or even in much larger events in our society. I'm wondering what you think about that idea that I've sort of picked up on.
Yeah, I think to be living right now in a female body, as we know, is super complicated. There's a story in the collection also called Feel Better that's all about a woman who sort of, in quotes, feels too much. And I take that to an extreme where she can feel everything. And I feel that way sometimes being in a female body. And there's a way in which in Corpse Pose, I was dealing with this idea of, well, could we have a narrator who doesn't have to deal with having a body and can still exist on the page as a full person without a body? And what would we gain as women not having bodies but still being in the world? And so that plays with that. And it's also a retelling of Sleeping Beauty. So that's in there as well. This idea of a woman who is beautiful. She's a yoga instructor in corpse pose. So she's the kind of classic Disney princess of today. So to be externally what a woman might be expected to be, and internally to have this whole other existence that somehow can't quite interact with the world. That was something I was trying to explore in that story. And I do think I explore in different ways in a lot of these stories.
Yeah, I can't wait for everybody to read Corpse Pose because that's exactly what happens. There is this beautiful yoga instructor who is not alive, but is somehow up there, lying there, and life is continuing all around her in many diverse ways, no spoilers. And I kept thinking about this story of, I mean, and there's so many ways to look at it. How some people sleep through life or sleepwalk through life or don't notice, are not observant, are not watchful, or are inactive, or can't, or are powerless, or are paralyzed by other forces. I mean, it is such a rich story in all the different ways you can access a meaning or a resonance. And even though the subject matter is a little bit, it's different. And I wonder about this too for you. There's a lot of satire, dark humor in your work. Some of the elements are absurd in that way of the literary absurdity. It's this form of existentialism, right? That looks at our human search for meaning in the world, right, as something absurd because the search will fail because the world is beyond our understanding, right? And I love it because I feel like what is more absurd than our world and our current situation? And how else can we think about this? How else can we look out there and try to act and comport ourselves and live as if there was meaning out there? But it seems to be beyond our understanding. And then when we see these elements in the stories, it's almost like I really have something to hang on to brace myself against and just sort of try to figure things out in the story from the absurdist elements. I teach too, and sometimes I'll occasionally have students who'll say, I don't like anything surreal, or I don't like, magic realism, or I don't like anything. I want it to be like completely realistic, or I don't get it. And I tell them, no, lean into those elements because that's where it's still a mystery. Life is a mystery, but it's there. But I wonder what you have come up against from readers or editors or others who are like those students that say, I don't know, I can't do it, in terms of these absurd elements. Do you find a lot of resistance to those elements in your work?
That's such an interesting question. I feel like there's definitely different people have different tolerance for what they may call surreal or absurd. And I think I have a pretty high tolerance in the sense that a lot of these things they don't always feel so surreal to me. They actually feel very real. So for instance, the beginning of the story Invented came to me because I think I was having like a little argument with my husband. It wasn't about a big deal, but he was annoying me. And I suddenly kind of got this thought in my head. What if I just made him up? What if he's not really here? And that became something that I then explored in this story where there's a woman who's convinced that she's completely invented her husband named Ed. That's Invented. And um that also comes from I'm an amateur meditator. I say amateur because I aspire to be more regular in my meditation practice than I actually am. But I use a lot of those sort of ideas that I have gleaned from meditation and from listening to Dharma talks and Buddhist ideas about what is real and what is just our projection of the world. And because I feel like they're both profound and absurd.
Okay.
And so, and then this makes me think too of like the story of the Time Museum.
Hmm.
I find time and living within time to be completely strange. So is that real or is it not that I'm the same person at age 57 that I was at age 5, even though I look completely different and all these things have supposedly happened. And I've had this kind of practice in my mind that I've done for a number of years where I'll imagine what it would be like if 57-year-old me, say, were to sit down next to 5-year-old me and just tell her, hey, so Lynn, this is what is going to happen in your life. And I'll sort of play with these ideas. And so to me, that is kind of realistic because I'm doing it in my real world. What is real? What is absurd? What the mysteries that kind of surround us all the time, they feel very real to me. So sometimes someone will say to me, how do you come up with this idea? Or that's so strange. But then when we talk, something about some element of the story will remind them of something very real in their life. So I guess in answer to your question, I love the way you talk to your students and have them lean into it. And I think people just sometimes don't even recognize that they have this awareness of the absurdity of things themselves. They just label it as, oh, that's some crazy thought I had, instead of maybe, well, let's explore it. And
Yeah.
maybe it's not so crazy. And maybe it can be expanded to understand something more about what it's like to be a human.
I just love this idea, and you kind of blew my mind a little bit. This idea of the 57-year-old me talking to the 5-year-old me, and makes me think about those people who photograph their baby every single day of their life. Uh, and I thought, yeah, it's that's not so far removed. But I also feel like my 5-year-old me would. I feel like 5-year-old me. Oh, it just blows my mind a little bit. It's very interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Hmm.
I feel like, oh, she's going to run the other way screaming, or she's going to like look deep into my eyes and say, I know exactly what's going on here. I'm not sure
Yeah.
which. Because feel better also resonates with me, like this idea of an empath practically, and which is can be a blessing and a curse. But there's so many elements like that that resonate, I think, as a woman when you express your feelings and people want you to be quiet or stop crying or stop talking about it, stop spiraling, stop looping. There's so much of that in our lives all the time that we have to be sort of checking ourselves and making sure we're not annoying people or irritating them. And then I think, but why? And then case in point, I feel like in Ayushi, here's the first line of the story. I was told by a bald man with no books left in him never to write in the second person, and also never to write a story about a writer. And then I feel like, okay, so this collection is not just about women's bodies, women's minds, women's feelings, but the ways we are controlled or restrained by rules and convention, expectations, what everybody else wants. Don't write in the second person. How many times have I heard that in my life? And and also, please don't write a story about a writer. I've heard that too. um, so I wonder if you can talk about that idea just in terms, maybe not around where I started my question, as like this metaphorical thing, people trying to tell us what to do or not to do, but as a writer, like these kinds of rules. I love the story Ayushi. I mean, second person is this thing that they tell you not to use, and time and again, I find that writers can use it to tremendous effect, and we're missing out. And I love stories about writers. They're out there. But I wonder if you can talk about this. Did this really happen to you? These sort of admonitions about don't do this and don't do this and don't do this all day long as writers.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad that you liked Ayushi, and I'm so glad you picked up on this. It did absolutely happen to me. I was on that first sentence that you read is probably the only autobiographical statement in the entire collection. I'm a rebel. If someone tells me I'm not supposed to do something, of course I'm going to try to do it. So, so I was in a writing retreat, and a visiting writer told us all not to write about a writer and not to write in the second person. And I decided not only am I going to do both of those things, but I'm also going to write in the first person and the third person in the same story, because that breaks every rule as well. You're supposed to pick a point of view and stick with it. I also write poetry, and so I'm familiar with the power of a formal constraint. And so I realized if I was going to do something that kind of wacky, I needed to make rules for myself. And so for that story, the rules that I made were that every paragraph would be 3 sentences long only. And the first sentence would be written in the first person, the second sentence in the second person, the third sentence in the third person. I had so much fun playing with that and seeing what that did, how it's about the same character, but it's each paragraph you get to hear how different it sounds to write about that character in the first, second, and third person. And so it was playful for me. I felt like it had enough organization that a reader would be able to understand it. And and I too think that the second person can, yes, maybe a whole novel in second person, although there are people who have done it successfully, but that could get tiresome. But I think certainly in short stories, there's so much power in the second person. And interestingly, the very first story in my collection is written in the second person. The sex was everywhere.
Yes.
And I think what that does is it kind of invites the reader in. It allows the reader to feel part of what's going on. It's kind of like an invisible arm around the shoulder of the reader saying, "Come, join me here in this made up world you're about to enter." Oh, the funny thing also about that, being told what I'm not supposed to do, I use she was I entered it into a flash fiction contest, and it was a finalist. It was one of three, and the judge, the guest judge, was in fact that visiting writer, which is kind of why I sent it into the contest. Now you can tell what kind of a student I'd be. I do very much what I'm told not to do in the biggest way I possibly can. And I thought to myself, well, if he picks this story, that'll say something really interesting about him. And if he doesn't pick my story, that'll also say something about him. It also might have said nothing about him at all. It might just be it might have said something about the other two stories, but he in the end did not choose that as the winner. But it tickled me greatly that he was going to have to read that story and make a decision, figure out what to do with it.
Oh, to have been a fly on the wall watching him read that
Hmm.
story. I love it. Uh, so, two things I want to say about this. So, when I interviewed Tommy Orange about Wandering Stars, in his novel, he has this alternating point of view. So, there's a first person narration, or there's a third, and sometimes a second. And we talked about this, and he talked about how, writing is not just inspiration. He said, writing is hard. You need discipline to be able to be very deliberate about the point of view that you're going to use. So he talked about how he uses it as a revision tool. And so he'll revise a chapter and try on different points of view. First is it's first, and if he shifts to third, certain things emerge that weren't there before. If he goes to second, same thing. And he talked about it in that way. And I felt like he has also received that same sort of slap on the wrist about not using second person. But again, when it emerged in the novel, you were so immersed in the story, you weren't sort of thinking, oh no, this is in second person. You were just sort of in the story, and at a certain point you are aware, and you're still so immersed in the story. So I love this idea of trying it and using it and seeing what it does for the story. So in Sex is Everywhere, can you talk about this story? This story is deeply affecting, I have to say. So I wonder if you can talk about it. Tell us what it's about, but also talk about it, and then maybe I can tell you a couple of things that I'm thinking about it.
I I really enjoy stories that take different shapes than a typical story, or that do something different right from the start. And I think of Sex Was Everywhere as a kind of a list story in the way that Rick Moody's Boys is a list story, or maybe Jamaica Kincaid's Girl. And so in this story, I really wanted to explore what it felt like to be a child in the world, a about to sort of come of age in a certain way, where there's an awareness of the adultness that's waiting for her, but she's not there yet. And so there's this refrain: sex was everywhere, but there was no sex. And what I love about in poetry, it's called an anaphora, where there's a repeated beginning of a phrase over and over again. And in the Rick Moody story, it's boys enter the house that keeps occurring over and over again. And so here I keep repeating sex was everywhere and there was no sex. And then there's urges, or there's body parts, or there's danger, or there's fear or competition. And it kind of, the arc of the story is all these other and there were ending in death. And it kind of has the same arc, I think, that the entire collection has, but in miniature. I love in poetry the way repetition, or in song, the way, I guess, a chorus kind of enables one to sort of sing the same thing over and over again, but yet the over and over again changes. It's like rolling down a hill.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how I think about that story.
I just love this idea, and there's something very resonant and concrete. Like I love hearing about the comparisons or the inspiration of the Rick Moody story and the Jamaica Kincaid story. But it's entirely its own story. But I love hearing about these other influences from poetry. But the subject matter itself, the things that occur in the story, these are stories about real things. There's so much else going on that is deeply, deeply resonant and real, and the verisimilitude of it is, and it's in such a different package. So first, it has to be said the playfulness of the stories is front and center and fun. You want to keep moving into the story when you start to read, and you start to pick up on what is happening here. This is a kind of a different approach. And the deeper you go into it, the more you are just in the story. It is a story. And I don't know how you did this, what magic powers you have, but it's so effective. So,
I'm glad you've said that. And it's interesting because I've had a number of readers recently tell me, "Oh, this really brought me back. That story really puts me in this place." I think there's something about childhood experiences um, that are so universal that even though in this story it may be, I don't know, getting the dollar hot dog at the luncheonette, and maybe that's not what somebody else experienced, but it makes them remember the equivalent for them. Or I think also the fact that it takes place in school, some of it,
yeah.
there is something very universal about this experience of it being a child in the school. that I don't know. I don't even, I'm guessing. I don't know what it is about the specifics that happen in the story that tend to make other people think of their own early lives, but it does seem to have that, which is very cool.
I, I'm telling you, it was visceral for me. I had to get up and kind of walk around. There is a lot of tension in the story, and you're just sort of moving from post to post, right, in the story, and it's a very visceral experience. Yes, there's this recall of things, there's this odd tension, there's this kind of suspense, there's this kind of staring it in the face and not, covering your eyes, and there's the covering your eyes a little bit. It's genius. I mean, it's just a very interesting experience, and you articulate things I think that a lot of us have tucked away, like deep, deep, deep in those old dusty boxes of our memories that then just spring forth like maybe never before. Not even when when I've tried to write nonfiction about my childhood or something. I'm serious. There's some memories that percolated up to the surface that I just had not thought about in a long time.
Mm,
It's an amazing story.
thank you.
So another story of yours, Invented, which you've mentioned, it won the 2023 Bomb Fiction Prize. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Some of our listeners, I know, are super interested in the process of publishing. So, as someone like you who has had so much success publishing stories in a variety of journals, for example, and this book, what is your writing life like as a story writer? And I know you're a poet too, but what is your writing life like? What can you dispense? What can you share with us that we must know?
I feel like my most successful story writing experiences come from when I am just deeply fascinated for myself only in what it is that I'm puzzling through while I'm writing. And as once I start thinking, oh, imagining how it would come across, let's say to a future editor or a future reader, I know I'm lost. If I can stay in this place of what about this feels interesting to you, Lynn? What about this feels strange or mysterious? Keep digging at that. That I think is the only way to end up with a story that ultimately an editor at a journal is also going to find fascinating. I think we think so much about writing what we hope is going to be received a certain way, and you never know. The only thing you can do, I think, is write from that place of your own curiosity and stay in that. Don't come out of that dream exploration until it's entirely done. And then you're putting on your editor hat and you're moving some commas around. But stay as long as you can in the dream of your story, I feel. And then you're most likely to have something that's going to be worth something to somebody else as well.
Lynn Schmeidler, thank you so much for talking to me today about Half Lives. Thank you so much. I really
Thank
appreciate your time.
you. I've loved talking with you as well.
Lynn Schmeidler is the author of Half Lives. It's published by Autumn House Press. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.